May 26, 1940. In the chalk-lined tunnels deep beneath Dover Castle, the air was thick with stale cigar smoke and the metallic scent of despair. This was the command center for Operation Dynamo, and its chief, Vice-Admiral Bertram Ramsay, stood before a vast map of the English Channel. Every pin, every line on that map told a story of catastrophic failure. The British Expeditionary Force, the professional corps of Britain's army, along with the remnants of the French First Army, were trapped. Their backs were to the sea, crammed into a shrinking pocket around the French port of Dunkirk, a sliver of coastline no more than 7 miles deep. The professional military minds in that room, men trained in the rigid mathematics of naval warfare, were focused on professional tools, destroyers, troop transports, cross-channel ferries. Their calculations were brutally, terrifyingly clear. The German panzers were poised for the final kill. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. Dunkirk's harbor was a blazing wreck. In the best-case scenario, Ramsay's staff projected they might be able to extract 45,000 men over 2 days before the entire force was annihilated or forced into a humiliating mass surrender. It would be the single greatest military disaster in British history. In the high echelons of Allied command, the concept of a civilian armada of pleasure yachts and fishing smacks sailing into the teeth of the German war machine was not a strategy. It was the stuff of fantasy. It was an admission of utter desperation, an amateurish notion in a professional's war. They couldn't possibly know that the intricate plans they were laying with their warships would be wholly inadequate. They never imagined that the key to salvation wasn't in the grey, powerful hulls of their destroyers, but in a chaotic, motley flotilla of wooden-hulled, civilian-crewed boats that would soon appear on the horizon. This is the story of how the British military, facing its darkest hour, was saved not by grand strategy or superior firepower, but by the spontaneous, heroic, and completely unexpected intervention of its own people in their tiny boats, the Little Ship.
To understand the miracle of Dunkirk, one must first comprehend the sheer scale of the catastrophe that preceded it. On May 10, 1940, the German war machine had unleashed blitzkrieg, lightning war, upon the West. For months, the conflict had been a phony war, a period of tense inaction. But now, the storm had broken with unimaginable fury. The Allied strategy was predicated on a repeat of World War I. They expected a German thrust through the flat plains of Belgium and Holland, and had positioned their best forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, to meet it there. But the German plan, conceived by General Erich von Manstein, was a stroke of audacious genius. It was called Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut. While a secondary force attacked the Low Countries as a diversion, the main armoured thrust, Panzergruppe von Kleist, did the unthinkable. It smashed through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. The BEF, professional and well-drilled, was an army built for the last war. Its movements were deliberate, its communication reliant on telephone lines, its mindset geared towards a war of attrition. It was completely unprepared for the velocity of this new German warfare. The panzers, supported by shrieking Stuka dive bombers, didn't engage in frontal assaults. They bypassed strongpoints, severed communication lines, and created chaos in the rear. They moved with a speed that defied military logic. By May 20th, just 10 days into the campaign, German tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. The sickle cut was complete. The BEF, the French First Army, and the Belgian Army were cut off, their supply lines severed, their southern flank wide open. They were encircled. What followed was a desperate fighting retreat. Communication broke down. Units were isolated. Roads were clogged with terrified refugees, strafed mercilessly by the Luftwaffe. Captain Corelli Barnett of the Royal Artillery later wrote of the chaos, "There was a sense of the world turned upside down." The speed of it all was bewildering. One day you were in a prepared position, the next you were in a desperate race
for the coast with panzers on your tail. On May 24th, with the trap closing, an event occurred that remains one of the most debated of the war. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, ordered his panzers to halt on the Ahr Canal, just 10 miles from Dunkirk. Adolf Hitler himself visited headquarters and confirmed the order. The German spearheads, which could have driven into the heart of the Dunkirk pocket and annihilated the Allied forces, stopped dead. Historians still argue over the reason. Was it, as Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring boasted, to allow his air force the glory of finishing the job? Was it a strategic blunder, a failure to grasp the chance to end the war right there? Or was it, as some German generals claimed, a pragmatic decision to conserve the panzers for the final push on Paris, fearing they would get bogged down in the marshy terrain around Dunkirk? Whatever the reason, this halt order was an almost divine intervention. It created a small, precious window of time. It was in this window that Operation Dynamo was born. The task fell to Vice-Admiral Ramsay, a stern, meticulous 57-year-old naval officer who had retired and been recalled to service. Ramsay was the perfect man for an impossible job. From his headquarters in the dynamo room that had once powered Dover Castle, he began to assemble the pieces of a rescue plan. The official plan was centered on what the Royal Navy had: destroyers. These were the workhorses of the fleet, fast, well-armed, but designed for deep-water combat, not for evacuating troops from a shallow coastline. They were supplemented by anything that could carry men: minesweepers, cross-channel ferries, even Dutch coastal barges known as schuyts that had escaped the German advance. But the central, seemingly insurmountable problem was geography. The port of Dunkirk, with its deep-water quays, was the logical place to embark thousands of men. But by May 27th, relentless German bombing had turned it into a slaughterhouse of burning warehouses and cratered docks. The harbour was blocked by sunken ships. It was unusable. This left only the beaches. The long sandy beaches east of the town stretched for miles, but they were a logistical nightmare. They sloped so gently into the sea that a large ship like a destroyer with its deep draft had to anchor nearly a mile offshore. To get to these ships, soldiers would have to wade through the surf, a slow, exhausting and deadly process. The initial scenes were horrific. Thousands of men formed long, disciplined queues, stretching from the dunes down into the cold water. They stood there for hours, chest deep, a perfect target for the German artillery on the heights inland and for the Luftwaffe above. Private Alfred Baldwin of the 2nd Battalion, Gloucestershire Regiment, recalled the scene. "We were standing in the water and the Stukas came. You heard this horrible screaming noise and there was nothing you could do. You just pressed yourself into the sand and prayed. Men were hit all around you. The water turned red. You saw boats going up in flames. It felt utterly hopeless." The destroyers' crews did their best, sending their own small lifeboats and cutters ashore. But it was a painfully slow process. A destroyer might take 6 hours to embark a few hundred men, all while being a sitting duck for German bombers. On the first full day of the operation, May 27th, only 7,669 men were rescued. At that rate, the BEF would be wiped out long before a fraction could be saved. The official plan, relying on the professional Navy, was failing. Ramsay and his staff knew they needed something else. They needed a way to bridge the gap between the beaches and the ships. The idea had been germinating for days. On May 14th, the BBC had made a seemingly innocuous broadcast, asking all owners of self-propelled pleasure craft between 30 and 100 feet in length to register them with the Admiralty. Few listening understood its true purpose. But now, with the situation at Dunkirk dire, the call went out in earnest. Naval officers were dispatched with a desperate urgency to every boatyard, marina and yacht club from the Thames estuary to the Solent. The request was simple: we need your boats now.
What followed was a moment unique in modern warfare. This was not a conscription of vessels. It was a popular uprising of the sea. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the fishing ports of Ramsgate and Margate, hardened fishermen who knew the treacherous channel waters like the back of their hands readied their trawlers and drifters. In the yacht clubs of Poole and Shoreham, weekend sailors prepared their pristine pleasure craft for a journey into hell. On the River Thames, everything from elegant motor yachts to grimy tugboats and broad-beamed sailing barges answered the call. The human stories behind this civilian armada are the true heart of the Dunkirk legend. This was not a mission for the faint of heart. These were civilians, sailing their own, often uninsured boats into a war zone. One of the most famous was Charles Lightoller. At 66 years old, he was a retired commander and the most senior surviving officer of the RMS Titanic. When a naval officer arrived to commandeer his 58-foot motor yacht, the Sundowner, Lightoller refused. He would not let a young naval rating take his beloved boat into danger. He, his son Roger, and a young Sea Scout would take her across themselves. In his memoir, Titanic and Other Ships, Lightoller described the journey with characteristically British understatement. He navigated the chaos of the Channel, dodging mines and dive bombers. Arriving off Dunkirk, he saw a destroyer embark 50 men and get hit by a bomb. Lightoller skillfully brought the Sundowner alongside. He recalled, "The official estimate of our carrying capacity was 21. I took 130 on board." He packed them in like sardines, 50 on the deck and 80 below, and sailed them back to Ramsgate, his little boat dangerously overloaded, but his mission complete. Then there were the Thames Firemen. Their firefloat, the Massey Shore, was a working vessel designed to fight fires along the London docks. Crewed by volunteer firefighters, it sailed for Dunkirk. There, it not only ferried soldiers from the beach, but also fought fires along the battered harbour, its powerful pumps saving countless lives. Perhaps most emblematic were the fishermen. Men from Leigh-on-Sea, a small cockle fishing town in Essex, took their shallow draft boats, perfectly designed for navigating the sandbanks of the Thames estuary, across the Channel. These were not yachtsmen. These were working men whose lives depended on the sea. Their boat, the Endeavour, a 34-foot cockle boat, saved hundreds. Its skipper simply said, "Our boys were over there. We had to go and get them." Another famous vessel was the Tamzine, a 14-foot open-topped fishing boat, the smallest official vessel to take part. It is now preserved in the Imperial War Museum, a tiny symbol of immense courage. The motivation for these men was a powerful, unspoken cocktail of duty, patriotism, and a profound sense of kinship. One yachtsman, when asked why he went, gave a simple answer that spoke for them all. "Because I was a bloody fool, I suppose. And because if I didn't, I'd never be able to look myself in the mirror again." They were not soldiers. They were grocers, bank clerks, mechanics, and retirees. But in that moment, they became the unofficial navy of Great Britain. The sight that greeted the German pilots of the Luftwaffe must have been utterly baffling. Below them, sailing into a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and explosions, was a scene of maritime insanity. Sleek, grey destroyers weaved between lumbering Dutch barges. Elegant, white-hulled yachts dodged the geysers of water from exploding bombs. Grimy fishing trawlers, their decks stained with the grime of 1,000 catches, chugged purposefully towards the shore. It was an armada of amateurs, a floating chaos that defied all military doctrine. And yet, it worked. The genius of the little ships was not in their individual capacity, but in their collective function. They became the crucial link in the evacuation chain. Their shallow drafts allowed them to do what the destroyers could not, get right up to the beaches. Suddenly, the entire dynamic of the evacuation changed. The long, static lines of men wading into the sea dissolved. The little ships acted as water taxis, as shuttles in the world's most dangerous ferry service. A yacht might nose onto the sand, and desperate, exhausted soldiers would clamber aboard. The skipper would then motor out through the shell-pocked water to a waiting destroyer, transfer his human cargo, and immediately turn back for more.
This process was repeated endlessly, day and night. The courage and ingenuity on display were breathtaking. The two long breakwaters, or moles, that extended from Dunkirk harbour became vital embarkation points. The East Mole, a narrow wooden structure over a mile long, became a lifeline. Thousands of soldiers would queue along its length, horribly exposed to air attack. The skippers of the little ships, along with the naval vessels, would bring their boats alongside this rickety pier, often scraping their hulls against the pilings, while bombs fell around them. Men would jump and slide down ropes onto the decks. It was here that the destroyer HMS Shikari took off the last man from the mole on June 4th. The tales of heroism are countless. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution, RNLI, sent 19 of its lifeboats. One, the Jane Holland, was abandoned by its naval crew after they were machine-gunned. A group of soldiers, led by a royal engineer, managed to refloat it, get its engine started, and pilot it back to England themselves. Another lifeboat, the Abdi Beauclerk from Aldborough, had its rudder shot away. Its crew steered it for 7 hours back to Ramsgate using only its engines. The Luftwaffe did not make it easy. The Stuka dive bombers, with their terrifying Jericho trumpet sirens, were relentless. The civilian boats had no anti-aircraft guns, no armour, nothing but the skill of their skippers and a great deal of luck. Many were hit and sunk. The paddle steamer Fenella was hit by a bomb while alongside the East Mole, killing 300 men on board. The yacht Gypsy King was destroyed by a mine, but for every boat lost, it seemed 2 more pressed on. It is crucial to remember that this was not just a civilian effort. The Royal Navy was the backbone of the operation, and its sacrifice was immense. 6 British and 3 French destroyers were sunk, and 19 others were damaged. These ships braved what their crews called Bomb Alley and E-Boat Alley to bring the majority of the men home. But their effectiveness was multiplied tenfold by the Little Ships. A destroyer that might have spent 6 hours embarking 500 men from the beach could now take on the same number from a dozen shuttling yachts in under an hour, drastically reducing its time in the most dangerous waters. And above it all, another battle raged. The Royal Air Force, flying from bases in England, threw everything it had into providing an air umbrella over the beaches. Fighter command pilots, in their Hurricanes and Spitfires, flew mission after mission, often outnumbered 3 to 1 to keep the Stukas and Messerschmitts at bay. Many soldiers on the beach, seeing only the German planes that got through, bitterly complained, "Where is the RAF?" They couldn't see the furious dogfights taking place miles out over the channel, where RAF pilots were dying to protect them. The RAF lost 106 aircraft over Dunkirk, but they inflicted heavier losses on the Luftwaffe and, critically, prevented the German Air Force from ever gaining the complete, unchallenged superiority that would have made the evacuation impossible. When Operation Dynamo was finally called to a halt on June 4th, the final numbers were tallied in Ramsay's dynamo room. They were scarcely believable. The initial optimistic hope had been to rescue 45,000 men. The final verified number of Allied soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk was 338,226. Of these, over 120,000 were French, Belgian, and other Allied troops. It was a deliverance of biblical proportions. In the immediate aftermath, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons and delivered one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. He was careful to manage expectations, to remind the nation of the gravity of the situation. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory.
victory, he warned. Wars are not won by evacuations. He was right. Dunkirk was the culmination of a colossal military defeat. Britain had lost nearly all of its heavy equipment. Tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles had been abandoned on the beaches of France. The army that returned was an army in name only, exhausted and disarmed. And yet, Churchill understood the profound psychological power of what had just happened. The deliverance of the BEF meant that Britain still had an army. It had a professional corps of experienced soldiers, around which a new, larger force could be built. Had that army been lost, Britain's ability to continue the war would have been fatally compromised. The evacuation transformed a moment of national shame into a legend of national resilience. It gave birth to the Dunkirk Spirit, a sense of unity, of a people pulling together in the face of impossible odds. It was a story not of admirals and generals, but of ordinary people. The fishermen, the yachtsmen, the firemen. They had looked across the water and seen not just a military disaster, but their sons, their brothers, their neighbours, and they had gone to get them. The German command was stunned. They had had the British army cornered, ready for the slaughter. The halt order had been a mistake, but they still believed the Luftwaffe and the sea itself would finish the job. They could not comprehend the disorganized civilian nature of the rescue. In their own rigid, top-down military culture, such a spontaneous, popular mobilization was unthinkable. It did not compute. They saw it as a chaotic mess. Yet it had succeeded beyond their worst fears. The legacy of Dunkirk is profound. It was the moment that Britain, now standing alone against the might of Nazi Germany, found the collective will to fight on. The sight of the returning soldiers, exhausted and defeated, but home, hardened the resolve of the British people for the long, dark years that lay ahead. The little ships, most of which returned to their quiet civilian lives, became symbols of this resolve. Around 850 had participated. Today, the Association of Dunkirk Little Ships preserves the handful that remain, their wooden planks imbued with the memory of that desperate, glorious week. In the end, Allied command had planned a military evacuation using military assets. They had calculated the odds based on the professional tools of war, but they never knew, they could never have planned for, the power of a people determined to save their own. The tiny fishing boats and pleasure yachts were not weapons of war, but they were instruments of salvation. They were the margin between a catastrophic surrender and the chance to fight another day. Wars may not be won by evacuations, but the war itself can be lost by a single, devastating defeat. The Little Ships of Dunkirk did not win the war in May of 1940, but they absolutely saved it. They delivered an army from destruction, and with it, they delivered the future of freedom.